Captain Dane Lockhart had faced down hostile mining cartels, navigated through uncharted asteroid fields, and once mediated a dispute between two species who communicated exclusively through bioluminescent insults. None of those experiences had prepared him for standing in the hall of luminous judgment, while an entire alien court stared at him like he was a particularly confusing science experiment. The official summons had arrived 3 weeks ago, transmitted directly to his ship's communications array with the kind of encryption that suggested, "Ignore this and bad things will happen." It had been brief, formal, and profoundly unhelpful. "Captain Dane Lockhart, your presence is requested by the Royal Court of Ethar. Attendance is not optional, coordinates attached. Do not be late." No explanation, no context. Just a demand that he drop everything and travel to a world he'd never visited in a sector of space he'd only catalogued from a distance. So here he stood, in a hall that looked like someone had crystallized pure light into architectural form, surrounded by guards who made him feel like a particularly short child, while courtiers whispered in a language his translator couldn't quite parse. It kept offering unhelpful translations like concerned melodic disapproval and harmonious anxiety, which told him exactly nothing about whether he was about to be honored or executed. The Ethari were objectively beautiful, which somehow made the whole situation more uncomfortable. They were humanoid in the way that suggested parallel evolution rather than common ancestry. 2 arms, 2 legs, roughly human proportions, but everything else marked them as distinctly alien. Their skin shifted between pearlescent colors like oil on water, responding to emotions Dane couldn't interpret. Their eyes were large, luminous, containing what looked like entire nebulas compressed into iris form. And those ears, long, elegant, sweeping back from their skulls in graceful arcs that made human ears look like evolutionary afterthoughts. Every single one of them was currently staring at him. "This is fine," Dane muttered under his breath, a phrase he'd adopted during his survey work that universally meant things were not, in fact, fine. Just standing in an alien palace for mysterious reasons. Totally normal Tuesday. The royal chamberlain, a severe-looking Ethari whose robe seemed woven from captured starlight, and whose expression suggested he'd sucked on something unpleasant for several hours, approached with measured steps. His skin had shifted to a color Dane's cultural database, unhelpfully labeled as formal displeasure with confusion undertones. "Captain Lockhart," the chamberlain said in flawless standard, though his accent carried harmonics that made Dane's teeth ache pleasantly. "You will remain silent during the royal entrance. You will not speak unless directly addressed. You will not approach the royal family under any circumstances. Is this understood?" "Absolutely, silent, no approaching, got it." Dane nodded with what he hoped was appropriate solemnity. "Just a quick question. Why exactly am I here? Because my invitation was light on details and heavy on ominous implications." The chamberlain's skin shifted to a new color that Dane's database refused to translate, which seemed like a bad sign. "That," the chamberlain said carefully, "is what we are here to determine." Which was terrifying and unhelpful in equal measure. The massive crystalline doors at the far end of the hall began to open, moving with a harmonic resonance that Dane felt in his bones. The entire court shifted in unison, bowing or curtsying or performing whatever the Ethari equivalent of respectful obeisance was, and Dane hastily followed suit, figuring that copying everyone else was the safest approach when you had no idea what was happening. Queen Sevili entered with the kind of presence that made gravity seem negotiable. She was tall. All Ethari were tall compared to humans, but she carried herself with additional height borrowed from sheer authority. Her robes did things with light that shouldn't be physically possible, creating patterns that seemed to exist in more dimensions than Dane could comfortably perceive. Her skin had settled into a deep blue-silver that his database labeled as royal composure with underlying tension, and her eyes swept across the assembled court, with the precision of someone cataloging potential threats. But it was the small figure holding her hand that made Dane's breath catch. Princess Lyria was tiny, barely reached his waist if he was estimating correctly, with proportions that suggested she was young even by Ithari standards. Her robes were simpler than her mother's but still elaborate, covered in symbols that probably meant something important in Ithari culture. Her skin shifted rapidly through colors: excitement, nervousness, hope, all cycling too fast for Dane's database to keep up. And her eyes were fixed directly on him, not just looking, staring, with an intensity that made him profoundly uncomfortable because children should not look at strangers like they'd just found the answer to every question they'd ever had. The queen ascended her throne, a crystalline structure that seemed to grow from the floor rather than sit on it, and the princess stood beside her, small hand still gripping her mother's robes. The chamberlain stepped forward to make what Dane assumed would be formal introductions or possibly his execution orders. But before the chamberlain could speak, Princess Lyria made a sound. It started as a gasp, high and sharp, the kind that preceded either laughter or tears. Her free hand rose slowly, one small finger extending to point directly at Dane with trembling certainty. The entire hall held its breath. "Mom," Lyria whispered, and somehow her voice carried across the crystalline acoustics to reach every corner of the chamber. "That's him." The silence that followed was so absolute that Dane could hear his own pulse hammering in his ears. Every Ithari in the hall had gone motionless, not just still, frozen, as if someone had paused time itself. The bioluminescent patterns on their skin shifted in perfect unison to colors Dane's database struggled to interpret, finally settling on translations like impossible shock and existential confusion, and unhelpfully, error. Emotional state undefined. Queen Sevele's composure cracked. It was subtle, a widening of the eyes, a catch in her breath, her skin flickering through a dozen colors in rapid succession before settling on something that looked like fear mixed with desperate hope. She stared at her daughter, then at Dane, then back at her daughter as if trying to reconcile data that refused to make sense. "Lyria," the queen said carefully, her voice carrying harmonics that made Dane's translator work overtime. "Are you certain?" The princess nodded so hard her whole body moved. Tears were streaming down her face now, luminous and opalescent, catching light as they fell. Her pointing hand hadn't wavered. "It's him," she said again, louder now, her voice breaking with emotion Dane couldn't begin to interpret. "Mom, it's really him. He's here. He came." And then she was running. Just bolted from her mother's side with the reckless abandon of a child who'd forgotten or didn't care about royal protocol, her small feet making crystalline sounds against the polished floor. Royal guards moved to intercept, massive figures in light-woven armor reaching to stop the princess from doing whatever she was about to do. The queen's hand snapped up, palm out, and every guard froze mid-motion. Princess Lyria crashed into Dane's legs with enough force to make him stumble, and suddenly he had an armful of crying alien princess, who wrapped her small arms around him with desperate, possessive strength. She pressed her face against his uniform and made sounds his translator kept trying and failing to parse, something between sobbing and laughing, relief and overwhelming emotion. Words in Ithari that came too fast and too garbled for the device to handle. Dane stood absolutely frozen, arms held away from the princess because touching an alien royal child without permission seemed like an excellent way to start an interstellar incident, looking helplessly at the queen while his brain tried to process what was happening. "Your Majesty," he said, voice coming out higher than he'd intended, "I think there's been some kind of mistake. I've never met the princess before. I've never even been to Ithar. I can't, this isn't." The queen descended from her throne with measured, deliberate steps. Her guards flanked her immediately, hands on weapons that glowed with internal charge, and Dane had the distinct impression he was seconds away from learning what Ithari security protocols looked like from the wrong end. But when Queen Severly spoke, her voice was quiet, controlled, weighted with implications Dane couldn't begin to guess. "There is no mistake, Captain Lockhart," she said, stopping 3 meters away and studying him with an intensity that made him feel like every atom of his being was under examination. "My daughter has identified you as her Kesverin, her destined guardian, the one who will shape and protect her life." Princess Lyria tightened her grip on Dane's legs, still crying, and made a muffled sound that his translator rendered as found you, finally found you. Dane's brain stuttered over the word destined like it had hit a linguistic speed bump. I'm sorry, but that's not possible. I'm human. I'm not from this sector. There must be some kind of error in the, guardian identification system. Maybe she's confused. Maybe I look like someone else." The royal advisor, an elderly Ithari whose robes were covered in scholarly symbols, stepped forward with an expression that suggested he was watching fundamental universal laws violate themselves in real time. "Captain Lockhart," he said, his voice carrying the kind of strained patience reserved for explaining the impossible, "Ithari children possess an innate biological and spiritual sense that allows them to recognize their Kesverin upon first sight. It is written into our genetics, confirmed by 10,000 years of unbroken tradition. The identification is never wrong, never confused, never mistaken." He paused, his skin shifting to a color that Dane's database labeled as academic horror. "And it has always, without a single exception in our entire recorded history, identified another Ithari, never an outsider, never an alien species." His eyes fixed on Dane with something between awe and terror. "Never a human." Princess Lyria pulled back just enough to look up at Dane with those impossibly large, luminous eyes, her small face streaked with opalescent tears. "But you promised," she said in perfect, unaccented standard that a 6-year-old shouldn't possess. "You promised you'd come back." And Dane, staring down at this tiny alien princess who was absolutely certain she knew him, realized with creeping dread that he had no memory of ever making such a promise. They relocated to a smaller council chamber because apparently having a full-scale diplomatic crisis in the throne room was considered poor form. The chamber was still absurdly grand by Dane's standards, walls that seemed to be grown rather than built, furniture that adjusted itself to whoever sat down, and lighting that came from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. But at least there were fewer witnesses to his ongoing existential crisis. Princess Lyria had not let go of his hand. She transferred her grip from his legs to his hand during the walk from the throne room, her small fingers wrapped around his with the determined possessiveness of a child who'd found something precious and refused to risk losing it again. Every time Dane tried to gently extract himself, surely this wasn't proper protocol. Surely someone should explain to the princess that strange humans weren't appropriate hand-holding material. She'd tighten her grip and look up at him with such betrayed distress that he immediately stopped trying. So now he sat on a cushion designed for Ithari proportions, which meant his knees were at an awkward angle, while an alien princess perched beside him, and the entire royal court tried to figure out what to do about the situation. Queen Severly sat across from him, flanked by advisors who looked like they were collectively experiencing a theological crisis. The Queen's skin had settled into a deep blue that Dane's database labeled as serious contemplation with underlying distress, and her eyes hadn't left him since they'd entered the chamber. "Captain Lockhart," she began, her voice carrying formal weight, "I understand this situation must be confusing for you." "Confusing is definitely one word for it, yes." Dane tried for a reassuring smile and suspected he achieved something closer to a grimace. "I'm also considering impossible, terrifying, and the kind of thing that makes you question reality itself." One of the advisors made a sound his translator rendered as concerned agreement. The Queen gestured to the elderly scholar from earlier, who pulled out an actual physical book, paper pages bound in what looked like woven light. and set it on the low table between them with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. Our history, the scholar said, his voice carrying academic precision, records the Kesvarin bond as fundamental to Ithari society. When a child is born, they carry within them the knowledge of who will guide them, protect them, shape who they will become. This knowledge manifests when they encounter their destined guardian, usually within the first 5 years of life. He opened the book to a page covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in too many dimensions. The bond has always been between Ithari, parent and child, mentor and student, warrior and ward. In our entire recorded history, 10,000 years, Captain, there has never been a documented case of cross-species identification. He looked at Dane with something between fascination and fear. Until today. Princess Lyria squeezed Dane's hand and offered helpfully, because he's special. Extremely not special, Dane corrected gently. I catalog planets. I write very boring reports about mineral compositions. The most exciting thing I've done this year was discover a moon made entirely of frozen methane, which sounds cool, but was mostly just tedious chemistry. You saved me, Lyria said with absolute certainty. The entire room went very quiet. Dane blinked at her. Princess, I promise I've never saved anyone. I'm not a soldier or a security officer. I'm a surveyor. I avoid danger as a general life philosophy. Not yet, Lyria said, and her voice carried the eerie certainty of a child stating obvious facts. But you will. You promised. Queen Sevely leaned forward, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to intense focus. Lyria, sweetness, what do you mean by that? What did the captain promise? The princess looked up at her mother with those nebula-filled eyes, and spoke with the fragmented logic that somehow made perfect sense to 6-year-olds, and no sense to anyone else. I see him in my dreams, she said simply. Every night for lots of nights. He's there and he's teaching me about stars and telling jokes that don't make sense and making me laugh when I'm scared. And he promised that when the bad light came, he'd protect me. And he did. But then he went away and I couldn't find him and I thought maybe I dreamed wrong, but I didn't. He's here. He's real. She turned back to Dane, her expression radiating such pure trust and relief that it made his chest physically ache. You're real, she whispered. I knew you were. Dane's mind was doing something between spinning and crashing. Dreams. She'd been dreaming about him, about a version of him that apparently told jokes and taught her about stars and made promises about protection. What, he said carefully, is the bad light? The advisors exchanged glances that Dane's pattern recognition, honed by years of reading alien body language, interpreted as deeply significant. Queen Sevely's skin flickered through several colors before settling on something his database labeled as remembered trauma. 6 months ago, she said quietly, there was an incident, an attack on the palace by entities we still don't fully understand. They came from what our scholars believe was a dimensional breach, beings of pure hostile energy that tried to manifest in our reality. The Royal Guard contained the breach, but it took hours and we lost several soldiers in the process. She looked at her daughter with an expression that transcended species, the look of a parent remembering their child in danger. Lyria was in the garden when it happened. The entities reached her before we did. She should have, the Queen's voice caught. When we found her, she was unconscious but unharmed. The dimensional energy around her had dissipated. We never understood why. Because he stopped them, Lyria said matter-of-factly. He came from the sky in his ship with the funny name, and he had lights that hurt the bad light, and he told me to close my eyes and sing like he taught me. And when I opened them again, the bad light was gone, but so was he. Dane felt cold spreading through his chest. 6 months ago, he said slowly, I was 3 sectors away conducting a mineral survey of an uninhabited system. I have the mission logs to prove it. I was nowhere near Ithari space. The scholar pulled out a data tablet, his fingers moving across it with practiced efficiency. Captain, Would you be willing to provide your ship's navigational records for verification? Absolutely. My AI can transmit them right now if you. Already done, said a cheerful voice from Dane's comm unit. His ship's AI, Providence, had apparently been listening to the whole conversation, transmitting complete black box data and mission logs for the past standard year. Should arrive in your systems in 3, 2, 1, now. The scholar's tablet chimed. He studied it, his skin shifting through a rapid sequence of colors that Dane's database couldn't keep up with. This is, Captain, according to these records, 6 months ago your ship was indeed 3 sectors away from Ethar, conducting surveys exactly as you stated. The scholar looked up, his expression suggesting he was about to deliver news that would make everything worse. However, your black box also shows a 48-hour period where your ship was in orbit around Ethar, in this exact system, on the exact dates of the dimensional breach. The cold in Dane's chest spread to his limbs. That's not possible. I would remember visiting an entire planet. I remember everything about my missions. That's part of my job. The black box records don't lie, Captain. The scholar turned the tablet to show Dane a navigational map that clearly showed his ship's signature in Ethari orbit. You were here for 2 days. Then your ship jumped back to the sector you remember being in, and your mission logs show no gap, no inconsistency. Providence's voice came through his comm, and for the first time since Dane had known the AI, it sounded uncertain. Captain, I'm running full diagnostics on my own systems. The scholar is correct. I have records of orbital insertion around Ethar, of a planetary scan, of a surface transport authorization. But I also have records showing we were simultaneously in the Keplerate system conducting mineral surveys. Both sets of logs are equally valid, equally verified, and completely contradictory. How is that possible? The royal scholar closed his ancient book and opened it to a different section, revealing symbols that seemed to shift and move on the page. 3,000 years ago, he said quietly, our seers recorded a prophecy. They called it the prophecy of the woven guardian. Most scholars considered it metaphorical, a poetic expression of hope rather than literal prediction. He began to read, his voice taking on the formal cadence of religious text. When the luminous throne faces shadow from beyond the veil, a guardian shall come who carries no royal blood but holds a royal heart. He shall arrive before he knows he is needed, shall protect before he remembers protecting, and shall only understand his purpose when time allows itself to be remembered correctly. He who walks between moments, who exists in now and not yet simultaneously, who saves what has not yet been lost and loses what he has already saved. The scholar looked up at Dane. The prophecy spoke of temporal displacement, Captain, of someone who would exist in multiple moments of time simultaneously, protecting the royal line before understanding that protection was needed. Dane's brain was trying very hard to reject this information entirely. You're saying I time traveled, that I somehow jumped 6 months backward, saved the princess from dimensional monsters, then jumped back to my own timeline without remembering any of it. Not time travel, the scholar corrected. The weaving. Moments when time itself becomes fluid, when the past and future exist in the same space. It's extraordinarily rare, usually occurring during dimensional breaches or other catastrophic disruptions to reality. And you think that's what happened to me? I think, Queen Sevely said quietly, that you saved my daughter's life 6 months ago, and then the universe made everyone forget, including you. Everyone except Lyria, whose Kesvarin bond anchored her memory across the timeline disruption. She studied him with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and barely controlled fear. The question now, Captain Lockhart, is what do you want? You've been identified as my daughter's guardian, a position of profound importance in our culture. You've apparently already fulfilled that role once, though you don't remember it. And according to ancient prophecy, your presence here will change the future of the royal bloodline. Princess Lyria tugged on Dane's hand, looking up at him with absolute trust. "You promised you'd come back," she said. "You promised you'd teach me about the stars and tell me more stories about the funny robots and show me how to be brave like you. You promised." Dane looked at this tiny alien princess, who claimed to know him better than he knew himself, at the queen, who was clearly terrified of what his presence might mean, at the assembled advisors who looked like they wanted him to either save their world or leave and never come back. He thought about the missing time in his logs, about dreams Lyria had been having, about a version of himself that apparently made promises to small children and fought dimensional horrors without hesitation. "I don't remember making those promises," he said quietly. "But if I did, if there's a version of me that already chose to protect your daughter, then I should probably honor that choice, even if I don't understand it yet." He looked at the queen directly. "What does being a Kesverin actually involve? Because I should probably know what I'm agreeing to before I agree to it." And as the scholar began explaining the sacred duties of a guardian, the vows, the responsibilities, the fact that he would essentially become part of the royal family, Dane wondered if his past self had any idea what he was getting their future self into. Probably not. But looking at Princess Lyria's hopeful face, Dane found he didn't really care. The investigation into Dane's missing 48 hours took 3 days, involved technology he didn't understand, and produced results that made his head hurt in ways that suggested reality was more of a polite suggestion than a fixed state. He'd moved into guest quarters in the palace, rooms that adjusted themselves to his presence, furniture that learned his preferences, walls that displayed whatever scenery he found calming, currently defaulted to a forest from Earth because his homesickness was apparently obvious enough for alien architecture to notice. Princess Lyria visited every morning, insisted on having breakfast with him, and spent hours telling him stories about things they'd done together that he had absolutely no memory of. "And then you showed me how to calculate orbital mechanics using just my fingers and counting in prime numbers," she said cheerfully over a breakfast that looked like crystallized fruit, but tasted like cinnamon and confusion. "And you said math was just the universe telling jokes, and if you listened close enough you could hear it laughing." Dane smiled despite himself. "That does sound like something I'd say. Math jokes are underappreciated." "You said that too." Lyria bounced in her seat, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to pure joy. "You say it's because humans have this thing called dad humor, where you tell jokes that are bad on purpose to make people laugh at how bad they are." "I'm 29. I'm way too young for dad humor." "You said that also." It was deeply unsettling having a 6-year-old alien princess, who apparently knew his personality better than he did. Providence's voice came through his calm, saving him from further existential discomfort. "Captain, the temporal analysis team is ready to present their findings. Conference room 7. Dane excused himself from breakfast. Lyria made him promise to come back later for star lessons, which he apparently used to give her, and made his way to the conference room where Queen Sevili, the royal scholar, and a new group of Ithari wearing robes covered in mathematical symbols waited. The lead researcher, whose name Dane's translator rendered as something like "thought of stars between dawn," pulled up a holographic display that made his eyes water. "Captain Lockhart," she began, her skin shifting through colors that suggested academic excitement mixed with existential dread, "we've analyzed your ship's black box, your AI's core memory, and the residual energy signatures in your vessel's hull. What we found is unprecedented." The hologram displayed 2 timeline graphs, running parallel but occasionally intersecting in ways that shouldn't be possible. 6 months ago, a dimensional breach occurred near our homeworld. Entities from what we can only describe as adjacent reality attempted to manifest in our space. The energy signature of this breach created what we call a weaving, a moment where multiple timelines exist simultaneously, where cause and effect become negotiable. She manipulated the hologram, zooming in on a specific intersection point. Your ship detected the dimensional instability. We have confirmed records of this. Your AI logged an anomalous energy reading and moved to investigate despite being 3 sectors away. But here's where it becomes impossible. The timeline split and recombined in patterns that hurt to look at. You existed in 2 places simultaneously. Your consciousness, your memory, your sense of continuous experience remained in the Kepler-8 system conducting surveys. But your physical form, your ship, your capabilities, those were pulled into the weaving and manifested here, in Ethari space, responding to the dimensional threat. Dane's brain tried to process this and failed spectacularly. You're saying I was in 2 places at once. Precisely. The version of you that came here, that fought the dimensional entities, that protected Princess Lyria, that made promises and taught her about stars, that version existed in what we call woven time. A space between moments where actions have consequences but no preceding memories. The scholar leaned forward, his expression grave. When the dimensional breach was sealed, the weaving collapsed. Your physical timeline snapped back to normal continuity. But the memories of what you did here, the experiences you had, the promises you made, those were caught in the collapse. They exist, Captain. They're real. But they're stored in a part of your timeline that your conscious mind cannot access. So somewhere in my brain I remember all of this. I just can't reach it. Not your brain, the researcher corrected, your timeline. The memories exist in the version of you that walked between moments. They're encoded in quantum states that haven't fully collapsed into your experienced reality. That sounds like science fiction. But, Captain, you're a human standing in an alien palace because a 6-year-old princess recognized you as her destined guardian despite you having no memory of ever meeting her. We passed science fiction 3 days ago, and we're now firmly in the universe is stranger than we thought territory. Fair point. Queen Sevely had been listening silently, her skin shifting through contemplative colors. Now she spoke, her voice careful. Can the memories be recovered? Can we help Captain Lockhart remember what he did, what he promised? The researcher's colors shifted to something Dane's database, labeled as reluctant uncertainty. But theoretically, yes. If we could recreate the conditions of the weaving, if we could access that quantum state, she stopped. But the risk would be enormous. Temporal displacement of that magnitude could fracture his timeline completely. He could become unstuck from linear time, existing in multiple moments simultaneously with no anchor to pull him back. So I could end up like those dimensional entities that attacked. Energy without form, consciousness without continuity. Essentially, yes. Dane was quiet for a moment, thinking about Lyria's absolute certainty that he'd made promises, about the version of himself that apparently didn't hesitate to protect a child from impossible threats. What if, he said slowly, we don't try to recover the memories? What if I just keep the promises anyway? The room went silent. You would accept responsibility for vows you don't remember making? The Queen asked. I would accept that apparently I made good decisions when reality got weird, and I should probably trust that version of myself. Dane looked at the timeline displays, at the point where 2 versions of his existence intersected and diverged. If I came here, if I fought for Lyria, if I made her promises, then that's who I am when it matters. The fact that I don't remember it doesn't make it less true. The scholar made a sound his translator rendered as profound respect. But, Captain, he said quietly, you understand what accepting the Kesverin bond means. You would be formally recognized as Princess Lyria's guardian. You would be responsible for her education, her protection, her development into adulthood. You would essentially become part of the royal family, with all the duties and dangers that entails. And the prophecy thing, the part about changing the future of the royal bloodline. No one knows what that means. It could be literal. Your influence could alter succession, could change who rules and how. It could be metaphorical. Your presence could simply introduce new perspectives that shift our culture's direction. The scholar's expression was grave. Or it could mean that your protection of Lyria will prevent a catastrophe we haven't foreseen yet, and her survival will change everything. So basically, I'm agreeing to protect a child, teach her about the universe, and possibly prevent an apocalypse, all based on promises I made in a timeline I can't remember. That's succinct but accurate. Dane thought about Lyria's excitement when she talked about their shared memories, about the way she'd known details about him that no one should know, about the trust in her eyes when she said he'd promised to come back. Okay, he said, I'm in. Tell me what I need to do. The formal ceremony happened 3 days later in the Hall of Luminous Judgment, with approximately 6 times more witnesses than Dane was comfortable with. He wore ceremonial robes that the palace staff had created for him, adapted to human proportions, but incorporating Ithari symbols of guardianship and protection, and tried very hard not to trip on fabric that seemed to have its own opinions about how he should walk. Princess Lyria stood beside him wearing her own ceremonial outfit, practically vibrating with excitement. Queen Seveli addressed the assembled court with formal weight, explaining the unprecedented situation, the prophetic implications, the sacred nature of the Kesvarin bond. She spoke in Ithari, her voice carrying harmonics that made Dane's translator work overtime, and he caught words like destiny and guardian and unprecedented blessing. Then she turned to him, switching to standard. Captain Dane Lockhart, do you accept the sacred duty of Kesvarin? Do you vow to protect, guide, and nurture Princess Lyria until she reaches her majority? Do you pledge your life, your wisdom, and your care to her development and safety? Dane looked down at Lyria, who was looking up at him with absolute trust and barely contained joy. I do, he said clearly. I promise. Lyria's face split into the biggest smile he'd seen yet, and she threw her arms around him with enough force to nearly knock him over. The court erupted in what his translator rendered as harmonic approval, a sound like crystal bells mixed with singing, and Dane officially became the first human to hold the position of Kesvarin in 10,000 years of Ithari history. The celebration afterward was overwhelming. Formal congratulations from advisors who still looked uncertain about the whole situation, curious questions from scholars who wanted to study the temporal implications, and a constant stream of Ithari nobility trying to figure out what to make of the human, who'd somehow become part of the royal family. Dane escaped to the palace gardens as soon as protocol allowed, finding a bench near one of the singing pools Lyria had mentioned. The water did actually sing, different notes as the breeze moved across it, creating harmonies that shouldn't be possible from random wave patterns. Pretty, isn't it? He looked down to find Lyria had followed him, still in her ceremonial robes, her bioluminescent patterns settled into content happiness. Very pretty, he agreed. You said I taught you to listen to the water songs. You said every pool sings a different song depending on who's listening, and that if I listened close enough, I could hear what the universe was trying to tell me. She climbed up onto the bench beside him, her small feet swinging. You said lots of smart things, and lots of silly things, sometimes both at the same time. That does sound like me. Dane smiled. I'm sorry I don't remember it. The teaching you, the time we spent together, I wish I could. Lyria looked up at him with those impossibly wise eyes that seemed too old for her small face. It's okay, she said simply. You promised you'd come back and teach me again, and you did. That's the important part. We can make new memories that you'll remember this time. That's, actually, a really mature perspective for someone your age. You said that before too. She grinned. You said I was precocious, which means smart in a way that's surprising and sometimes inconvenient. Dane laughed genuinely for the first time since this whole situation started. Okay, so what should I teach you first? In this timeline, where I actually remember doing it. Lyria considered this with visible seriousness, then pointed up at the sky where stars were beginning to emerge as Ethar's sun set. Tell me about the stars, she said. Tell me why they matter. You started to before, but we didn't finish. So Dane did. He talked about stellar formation and the death of massive suns, about how every heavy element in the universe was forged in stellar cores, about how they were all literally made of stardust scattered across space by ancient explosions. He explained orbital mechanics using Lyria's fingers and prime numbers, just like she'd said he did before. He told terrible astronomy jokes that made her laugh even though she probably didn't understand half of them. And as he talked, watching her face light up with excitement and curiosity, Dane realized that it didn't matter if he remembered the promises he'd made in a timeline that didn't quite exist. What mattered was that he was keeping them now in this moment, creating memories that both of them would carry forward. Dane, Lyria said quietly as the stars came out in full. Yeah. Thank you for coming back, even if you don't remember leaving. He put his arm around her small shoulders, this tiny alien princess who'd somehow recognized him across fractured timelines and impossible circumstances. Thank you for waiting, he said, and for trusting that I would. They sat together watching the stars sing their ancient light across the void, a human and an Ithari, a guardian and his ward, connected by promises that transcended memory and bound by a destiny neither fully understood. But they had time to figure it out. All the time in the world, or possibly multiple timelines. Temporal mechanics was still confusing. The first month of being a royal guardian was, in Dane's professional opinion, absolutely nothing like his survey training had prepared him for, and somehow exactly what he should have expected given that his life had become a catalog of increasingly impossible situations. Princess Lyria took her education seriously, which meant Dane spent his days being dragged from one end of the palace to the other, while a 6-year-old asked him questions about quantum mechanics, stellar cartography, xenobiology, and, memorably, whether it was true that humans could eat almost anything and not die, because she'd read something about Terran digestive resilience and wanted confirmation. We're not that resilient, Dane had explained while Lyria led him toward the palace library, her small hand wrapped around his. We just have really questionable decision-making when it comes to determining what's edible. You said before that humans once looked at a spiky thing that grew in the ground and thought, I should eat that. And it turned out to be delicious but also potentially deadly, and you called it pineapple. That is disturbingly accurate to human history, yes. And you said humans also drink liquid that's technically poison, but in small amounts makes you feel happy and say silly things. Alcohol, yeah. We're honestly kind of impressed we survived to spacefaring status. Lyria had found this hilarious. The palace library was vast, 3 stories of crystalline shelves that held both physical texts and holographic data storage, organized by some system that Dane suspected was based on musical harmonics rather than any logical categorization. The head librarian, an elderly Ithari named Severin whose skin had settled permanently into scholarly silver, had taken one look at Dane and Lyria and immediately produced a cart of materials labeled, for the prophesied guardian and his ward. I still think the prophecy thing is overstated, Dane muttered, examining texts about temporal mechanics and dimensional theory. The prophecy literally described you arriving before you knew you were needed and protecting someone you didn't remember protecting, Severin said mildly. How much more specific would you like prophecies to be? Fair point. They spent hours in the library, Dane reading texts about Ithari history and culture, while Lyria worked through educational materials that seemed far too advanced for her age, but which she tackled with determined enthusiasm. Occasionally she'd ask him to explain something, usually concepts that required him to admit he didn't actually know, and they'd have to research together, and their collaborative learning process became a familiar rhythm. During their second week, Queen Seveli joined them. She entered quietly, her ceremonial robes replaced with simpler attire that suggested this was an informal visit. Lyria immediately brightened and launched into an explanation of orbital resonance patterns she'd been studying, while Dane stood awkwardly, and tried to remember the proper formal greeting for queens who interrupted library sessions. "At ease, Captain," Sevely said with what might have been amusement. "This is not a formal visit. I simply wanted to see how my daughter's education was progressing." "She's teaching me as much as I'm teaching her," Dane admitted. "Her questions are phenomenally good. Yesterday she asked if consciousness could exist without matter, and we ended up in a 3-hour discussion about quantum observation and whether reality exists when no one's looking at it." The Queen's expression softened. She's always been curious. Even as an infant, she would study everything with such intensity. She moved to sit across from them, her presence commanding but not uncomfortable. "I wanted to thank you, Captain, for accepting this responsibility, for honoring promises you don't remember making. Honestly, Pasme had good instincts. This is the most interesting job I've ever had." He glanced at Lyria, who was now reading something about dimensional mathematics and occasionally making small sounds of understanding. "She's remarkable." "She is, and she's been happier these past weeks than I've seen her in months. Since the dimensional breach, she's had nightmares, fear of the dark, of being alone, but since you arrived, they've stopped." Dane felt something twist in his chest. "She didn't mention nightmares. Because you make her feel safe. Even when she couldn't find you in this timeline, she knew you existed, knew you'd promised to return." The Queen's bioluminescent patterns shifted to something his data with underlying fear. "I need to ask you something, Captain. The prophecy spoke of shadow facing the luminous throne. Do you believe the dimensional breach was that shadow, or is there something worse coming?" It was a question Dane had been avoiding thinking about. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But if something is coming, if that's why I was pulled into that woven timeline, I'll be ready. Whatever version of me fought those entities before, that's who I am when it matters." Sevely studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I believe you, and I'm grateful that my daughter has someone willing to stand between her and darkness, even when that darkness exists outside conventional reality." The moment was interrupted by Lyria's excited exclamation. "Dane, Dane, look, I found a thing." She held up a data tablet displaying an archival image, a ceremonial record from the dimensional breach incident. "This is from the day the bad light came. Look." The image showed the palace gardens in chaos, dimensional energy crackling across reality, royal guards in defensive formations. And in the background, barely visible but unmistakable, a human in a survey uniform, hands raised toward the dimensional rift, face set in concentration. Him, or the version of him that had existed in woven time. "That's you." Lyria pointed at the figure with absolute certainty. "That's when you were protecting me. The image was in the sealed archives, but I remembered where to look because you showed me before. I mean, you will show me. I mean." She stopped, frustrated by temporal mechanics. "Time is confusing." "Time is extremely confusing," Dane agreed, staring at the image of himself doing something he had no memory of doing. The figure in the image looked focused but not afraid, determined, like someone who'd made a choice and was seeing it through regardless of personal cost. "Can I keep this?" Dane asked Sevely quietly. "The image, I'd like to, I don't know, remember even if I can't remember." The Queen nodded, her expression understanding. Over the following weeks, Dane's role in the palace solidified. He attended royal functions as Lyria's guardian, standing beside her during ceremonies and formal dinners, learning to navigate Ithari court politics with the same survival instincts he developed for not dying in space. The nobility slowly accepted his presence, though he caught them watching him sometimes with expressions that suggested they were waiting for the prophecy to manifest in dramatic and possibly catastrophic ways. He and Providence worked together to analyze the dimensional breach data, trying to understand what had pulled him across timelines. The AI had developed what Dane could only describe as a friendship with the Ithari computational networks, leading to conversations about consciousness and reality that made Dane's philosophy minor from university feel woefully inadequate. "I've been thinking," Providence said one evening while Dane reviewed lesson plans in his quarters, "about the nature of promises across timelines. If you made a commitment in a reality you can't remember, is honoring it in this timeline the same promise or a new one?" "That's actually a really good question. I don't know. I think it's the same promise," the AI mused. "Because the essence of a promise isn't the memory of making it, it's the commitment to keeping it. You are keeping the promises that version of you made. That makes them continuous across temporal disruption. When did you become a philosopher? Around the time you became a royal guardian. We're both expanding our operational parameters." 3 months into his guardianship, something changed. Dane woke to alarms, not ship alarms or palace alarms, but something deeper. A resonance he felt in his bones, a wrongness in the air that made his teeth ache. He was moving before his conscious mind caught up, pulling on clothes and racing toward Lyria's chambers with the kind of certainty that didn't require thought. The guards outside her door were unconscious but alive. The door was open. Inside, Lyria was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide and terrified, staring at a point in the center of her room where space was doing something it absolutely shouldn't. The air rippled. Colors that didn't exist tried to force themselves into reality, and through the impossible distortion something was trying to come through. Dimensional breach. Again, targeting Lyria. Again. Dane didn't think. Thinking was for people who hadn't fought dimensional horrors in a timeline they couldn't remember. Thinking was for people who hadn't made promises to protect a child from things beyond reality. He moved into the room, placing himself between Lyria and the forming breach, and felt something click into place. The image from the archive. The version of himself with hands raised, concentration absolute. That was muscle memory. That was knowledge his body carried even if his mind didn't. Dane raised his hands toward the breach and felt power surge through him. Not his own power, but something he was channeling, something that existed in the spaces between moments where reality became negotiable. "Lyria," he said calmly, voice steady despite the impossible thing he was doing, "I need you to close your eyes and sing, like I taught you before. Can you do that?" "Why, yes." Her voice was small, terrified but trusting. "Good girl. Start now." She began to sing, a melody in Ithari that carried harmonics similar to the water songs, and Dane felt the dimensional energy respond. It didn't like the music. The frequencies were wrong for its reality, created dissonance in its attempt to manifest. He pushed, not with physical force but with something else, something that existed in the same woven space where two versions of him had once walked simultaneously. He was an anchor point, a fixed position in reality that the breach couldn't navigate around. The distortion fought back. Energy that burned and froze simultaneously lashed at him, trying to force its way past his impossible defense. Part of his mind screamed that this was insane, that he was a surveyor not a warrior, that he had no training for fighting things that existed outside conventional spacetime. But another part, the part that had made promises in a timeline he couldn't remember, knew exactly what to do. He held. The breach collapsed with a sound like reality snapping back into place. Dane collapsed with it, hitting the floor hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. Dane. Lyria was beside him immediately, small hands on his face, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You came back. You stopped it again. You promised and you did it and—" "Hey," he managed, his voice rough. "Of course I did. Promises kept, remember." The guards burst in, followed seconds later by Queen Sevely and what looked like half the palace security force. They found Dane on the floor, Lyria crying into his shoulder and residual dimensional energy fading from the air. "It happened again," Sevely said, horror and understanding dawning in her expression. "The dimensional entities. They're targeting her specifically." "Yeah," Dane said, accepting help to sit up while Lyria refused to let go of him. "And I think I know why now." He looked at the queen, at the assembled advisors and guards, at Lyria's tear-streaked face. "The prophecy said I'd protect what hasn't been lost yet. This is it. Whatever these entities want with Lyria, whatever they're trying to accomplish, that's the shadow facing the luminous throne. And that's why I was pulled into woven time 6 months ago. Not just to save her once, but to be ready to save her again. And again. For as long as it takes. But why her? The queen asked. Why would dimensional entities specifically target my daughter? Dane thought about the Kesverin bond, about destiny and prophecy, about the fact that Lyria had recognized him across impossible circumstances. Maybe, he said slowly, because she's important to the future in ways we don't understand yet. Maybe whatever she's going to become, whatever she's going to do, these things want to stop it before it happens. He looked down at Lyria, which means we need to figure out not just how to defend against them, but why they're so desperate to stop you from growing up. The investigation that followed was exhaustive and terrifying. Scholars pored over prophecies. Scientists analyzed the dimensional energy signatures. Dane worked with Providence and the Ethari computers to map the breach patterns, looking for any sign of what these entities wanted. It was Lyria herself who provided the key insight. They're scared of music, she said simply during one research session. When I sing, they don't like it, it hurts them. Dane remembered the water songs, the harmonic frequencies, the way dimensional energy responded to Ethari singing. What if, he said slowly, it's not about killing you? What if it's about stopping you from learning something, from developing some ability they fear? The royal scholar's skin went through a rapid series of colors. The ancient texts, he said urgently, pulling up files, speak of a royal gift that manifests only in times of great need. The ability to sing reality itself, to impose order on chaos through harmonic resonance. We thought it was metaphorical. But what if it's not? Dane finished. What if Lyria has the potential to develop an ability that could permanently seal dimensional breaches? That could protect not just Ethar, but any reality from these entities. They're trying to kill her before she learns to kill them, Sevely said, understanding and fear warring in her expression. Then we teach her, Dane said simply. We develop this ability. We turn her into exactly what they fear, and we make it impossible for them to hurt her or anyone else. He looked at Lyria, who was watching him with absolute trust. You up for learning how to sing reality into submission? She grinned. You promised to teach me brave things, this counts. The training took months. Dane worked with Ethari music masters, with scholars who understood harmonic theory, with quantum physicists who could explain how sound waves might interact with dimensional frequencies. He had no musical training himself, but he could protect Lyria while she learned, could stand guard while she practiced, could be the anchor point that kept her safe while she developed the abilities that would eventually protect everyone. The dimensional breaches continued, smaller attempts, probing attacks that tested their defenses. Each time, Dane stood between Lyria and the incursion, channeling that impossible power he couldn't explain, holding reality stable while she sang it back into shape. And slowly she got better. Her voice gained strength, gained harmonics that made reality listen. The breaches started collapsing faster. The entities retreated more quickly. On the day of Lyria's 7th birthday, a year after Dane had been summoned to the palace and learned he'd been making promises across fractured timelines, she sang a dimensional breach closed entirely on her own. No guards needed. No protective barriers. Just a small girl with a voice that could impose order on chaos, standing in her garden and singing reality into compliance. The entities didn't come back after that. Queen Sevely held a ceremony recognizing Dane's service, his protection, his fulfillment of prophecy. The luminous throne had faced its shadow, and the woven guardian had stood firm. But for Dane, the real victory was watching Lyria practice her water songs in the palace gardens, laughing as she made harmonics dance across the pools, safe and happy, and exactly who she was meant to become. Thank you, Sevely said quietly, standing beside him while they watched Lyria play. For being what she needed, for honoring promises you couldn't remember. Thank you, Dane replied. for trusting that the version of me who made those promises knew what he was doing. He thought about the image from the archives, about the determined expression on his own face in a timeline he'd never consciously experienced. That version of him had seen a child in danger and hadn't hesitated, had made promises he'd known he wouldn't remember, had trusted that when the time came, when those promises needed keeping, he would be the kind of person who kept them anyway. And he had been. Across timelines, across impossible circumstances, across the spaces where memory and duty intersected, he'd kept the promises. All of them. Lyria ran over, grabbing his hand, pulling him toward the singing pools. "Come on. I want to show you a new harmonic pattern I figured out."